Barbara Kotschwar of the Peterson Institute for International Economics was in the Havana airport when President Obama announced that the United States was going to normalize or improve economic and political relations with Cuba. This is Steve Wiseman at the Peterson Institute to talk to Barbara about this development and what it promises for the future of one of the most contentious relationships in the world for a half century. Barbara, first of all, what were you doing in Cuba?
I was coincidentally in a seminar on U.S.-Cuba relations for the first part of the week, but I don't think too many people in the room were expecting at least the magnitude of this announcement.
And one of the things that took you there was your book, written with Gary Huffbauer, on economic normalization with Cuba that the Peterson Institute published earlier this year.
Correct.
So what did that book do? That book sounds awfully prophetic or prescient to me.
Well, so the reason we wrote this book was we looked at the situation in both Cuba and the U.S. and saw that the winds of change were starting to blow a little bit harder with the economic reforms in Cuba. Since taking office, President Raul Castro has liberalized a number of economic activities, has allowed Cubans to travel, for example, without an exit visa, which is a first, has allowed Cubans to rent and own property. The Obama administration has released some of the restrictions on travel, and I actually found out about this historical change in policy from a farmer from Michigan who was sitting next to me on the plane, who was in Cuba on a people-to-people exchange. He'd been there for a week or so, scoping out the Cuban agricultural sector and seeing what could be done there.
Now, the president lifted some, but not all of the economic restrictions on Cuba. But you in Havana, you'd been there 15 years earlier, saw some examples of how Raul Castro's policies had already begun to change the landscape there. Tell me about that.
Right, so compared to 15 years ago, I mean, there's a lot more economic activity. There's a lot more private tiendas, stores set up. There are a lot more places where you can go and buy stuff, trinkets, what they call artesania, sort of arts and crafts. You can now legally go into a restaurant that's managed by a small number of people, have a nice dinner, and then, walk down the street and sort of pay to see musicians playing. It's really changed the face of Cuba. I mean, it's still a centrally planned economy. There's still real limitations on the types of economic activity. There are, 100 plus economic activities that you can undertake, from being a barber to planning quinceañera parties, the traditional 15-year parties. I think now wedding planning is one of them. You can be a mechanic, but there are certain things that still are not open to Cubans as private enterprise. But there really is a lot more economic dynamism than there was 15 years ago. So when I was there the first time, people would try to sell you stuff, but it was really sort of, on the margins. It was obviously black market, and now it's out in the open. And I think that type of entrepreneurial activity is what needs to be fostered and what's going to bring about more pressure for greater economic openness. The fact that, as you mentioned, the releasing of some of these restrictions or the lessening of the restrictions certainly does not end the embargo. Right? The president is still constrained by the Helms-Burton Act, and only Congress can do that. But allowing greater travel, allowing a greater amount of remittances to go to individuals and to support business will help these people create more of an entrepreneurial class.
And historically, in some countries, an entrepreneurial class then demands political freedoms. Right. That's what Congress would be looking for as well, maybe even more so.
Well, that's the stated objective of the policy. right? And I think that's the hope of the policymakers who are, trying to increase the exchange of ideas and the fostering of these small, I guess, micro and small entrepreneurs who will then gain a real interest in maintaining this type of economic activity.
Now, the subtitle of your book is, as we mentioned, a roadmap for U.S. policymakers. So what is the roadmap now in your view?
So the real message there is that economic liberalization, we see as a good thing. We kind of assume away the politics. We can do that as economists, right? Although the politics are what determine this relationship. But we look at political normalization as a point of departure and then try to see what would economic normalization between Cuba and the United States look like? What would it look like when the two countries start treating each other more as normal countries and then perhaps as supernormal countries, right? As countries that have a greater economic stake in one another, and that would be deeper economic relations. That's looking sort of, far into the future. We say that economic normalization should be done in a considerate manner, should be done slowly and thinking about the consequences. So we warn against sudden normalization without setting a groundwork that will allow Cuba to have the economic and political institutions that will support a free and competitive market. We caution against the sort of big bang approach that was taken in Russia, where opening the economic system, which was done suddenly, led to already entrenched interest becoming even more entrenched. And to use sort of a less dramatic example, countries like Mexico, where the privatization of the telecommunications sector led to a privately held monopoly, which Mexico now has to take great steps to roll back and to reform. So we really, given the nature of the Cuban economy, given the types of interests that could develop, we urge U.S. policymakers to engage in careful conversations with their counterparts. We think that the exchange of ideas, the exchange of economic actors, of policymakers, of academics is really important. Learning about each other's regulatory systems, I think, is important in advance of economic normalization. So the lifting of restrictions on traveling is very, very positive, we think. Folks from the NIST, for example, who manage U.S. standards and conformity assessment procedures, should be encouraged to go to Cuba and see how the two can come to an agreement that will allow goods to be exchanged easily and fairly across borders.
Well, just to summarize, though, I think you believe this step taken by President Obama is a good first step toward that roadmap.
I think so. I think it's absolutely a good and an important first step. I think that this is something that could allow the Cuban entrepreneurial class to develop, and I think it's an opportunity for American entrepreneurs, American policymakers, Americans who are interested in Cuba to travel there and to exchange ideas with Cuba and to set the groundwork for a negotiation between the two countries that will eventually lead to a more competitive marketplace in Cuba.
Barbara, thanks very much.
Thank you.